There we go, not bad. I know you folks get stuff.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joan Thomas, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, in the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers also rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. Before I get into the evening itself, I will mention if you have just arrived and are looking for a seat, there are still some just over here. There is also an aisle in the middle, so you won't have to clamber on top of people to get to them. We are gathered here today to celebrate the launch of the latest novel from Joan Thomas, Wild Hope, published by HarperCollins Canada, to which you may applaud. We're always delighted by any opportunity to celebrate Joan and her work here at the store, so this is fantastic, and we're so pleased that so many of you could join us here in person and virtually on YouTube as well. I won't take up too much time because no one is here to listen to me, but I do have a few exciting housekeeping notes to tell you just right out of the gate. The first is that we couldn't do all that we do were it not for the support of an incredible writing community here in the city, and we're thrilled to not only be highlighting work by authors like Joan, but also working in collaboration with the Winnipeg International Writers Festival. This event is being presented as part of Thin Air 2023, and the artistic director of the festival, Charlene Deal, will be up at the end of the event to tell you just a little bit more about that. The evening will proceed with a reading from the podium here, followed by a conversation between Joan and my boss, Chris Hall, which will take place at these chairs just to my left. Following that, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. So if anybody here has a question, please just feel free to put up your hand and I'll run over to you with a microphone. Not a comment on your ability to project, it just ensures that those watching at home can hear the question and prevents us from having to repeat it. If you are one of those people watching live on YouTube, feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat or any positive and supportive comments as well. We'll interrogate Joan with the questions and pass along those positive notes to her afterward. I had originally drafted a verbose and kind of ridiculous summary of why I really like this book. However, I realized I should probably turn things over to the professionals because when I read the pull quote by Carolyn Anderson on the back of the book, it summed up everything I had to say much more eloquently. So in the words of Carolyn Anderson, author of A Russian Sister and Ellen in Pieces, Wild Hope is both riveting and deeply moral. It's a page-turner that rises to the level of metaphor. As beautifully wrought as all of Thomas's novels, it is her most political, and it asks the existential questions of our time. Can art, idealism, and love withstand the merciless onslaught of the climate crisis? And if the fate of the planet really does depend on the egotistical whims of men acting out their childhood grievances, are we doomed? Thankfully, Thomas is also our guide, so there is a positive note, leading us to the wild places where we might indeed find hope, and perhaps even justice. Your host for this evening, Chris Hall, has been with McNally Robinson Booksellers for more than 25 years, more than 10 of which as owner. When he isn't reading or walking, he loves to travel and cook. He lives in Winnipeg and is currently training his daughters to become booksellers. Our guest of honor this evening, Joan Thomas, is the author of 5 novels, most recently, with the exception of Wild Hope, 5 Wives, which won the Governor General's Award for Fiction. Her first novel, Reading by Lightning, won the Commonwealth Prize for Best First Book, Canada and the Caribbean, and the Amazon.ca First Novel Award, and was nominated for 4 other awards, including the International Impact Dublin Literary Award. Her best-selling novel, Curiosity, was named a Quill and Choir Book of the Year and was nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, as well as the International Impact Dublin Literary Award. The Opening Sky won the McNally Robinson Prize for Book of the Year and was a finalist for the Governor General's Award for Fiction. A recipient of the Writers Trust of Canada Engel Findlay Award. Joan Thomas lives in Winnipeg and is here with us tonight. Please give her a very warm welcome.
Where did you go?
Well, thank you, Joan.
Well, John, thank you so much. You're a hero in this city for the parties you throw for writers. We just love you. And a huge welcome to all of you. It's so lovely to sit up there and look over this crowd and see so many faces of old friends and people that I don't know, which is also wonderful because it means that I have a few readers outside my friends. I really want to also say a huge thank you to McNally's. Without this store, we would be, you know, eccentric, solitary readers and writers with sitting alone among our pile of books. But because of this store, we have a community and, you know, we sort of normalize our obsessive bookishness. So we're very grateful. I want to thank Chris for making the store run and for being willing to ask questions tonight, to have a conversation with me, and Charlene for all the work that you do in the festival to bring attention to our work. We're very grateful. So Wild Hope is a contemporary novel, and it's a fully invented story. It took me quite a while to find the story within the material that was kind of amorphous in my mind. And I'm not sure that I would have gotten to that story without the help of some really good readers. One of them is Sam Bardman, who is generously taking photographs tonight. And he read this manuscript at a very early stage when it was actually a mess, right? But when we sat down to talk about it, he had written at the top of his copious notes what in my mind was my true and deepest intention in the story. He had seen it, he had got it. And his observations about how I might get to it sort of lit up my way for another year of rewriting. So I'm very grateful, Sam. I've also been very lucky in my editor, Jennifer Lambert at HarperCollins. She has a light touch and she has excellent judgment about what belongs in a story and what doesn't. And she was extremely helpful to me. My daughter Caitlin and my husband Bill were also early readers, and I try not to subject them to an in-depth interrogation about the book because I value their reading and I value them as kind of a cheering squad, but I also find that their instincts are really good and very helpful to me. I want to say a warm thank you to all the friends in this room whose companionship and conversations sustain and inspire me. Some of you have been to all 5 of my book launches, which is very serious support, and I really value it. Wild Hope is dedicated to 2 of my longtime friends, one of whom is also a beloved friend to many of you, the wise and witty Heidi Harms. So, this book, now for something completely different, we might say. 5 Wives had 7 narrative points of view. And in this book, I was determined to have only one. I had in mind a young woman named Isla, whose general sense of well-being and openness and happiness in life appealed to me as a good foundation for telling a story. I wanted to tell the whole story from her perspective in the first person, but apparently you can't teach an old dog new tricks, because very shortly, her boyfriend Jake kind of insisted on having his perspective honored as well. So as an aside, if you like to listen to fiction rather than read it, the audiobook has 2 actors, and I'm very pleased with that. It has a male and a female actor that voice the 2 perspectives in the novel. The spine of the story is the love relationship between Isla and Jake. Isla is a chef and Jake is a visual artist. They meet at Jake's first art show, which Isla's restaurant is catering. And I'll just mention, because it's sort of alluded to in these passages, that Isla knew Jake's father by reputation because he was a federal cabinet minister and a very controversial figure. And by sheer coincidence, Jake knew Isla's father because he's a psychology prof and Jake took a couple of his courses. So I'm going to start with a passage from Isla's point of view at the art show where they meet. I had dated an artist the year before and found his world interesting. So after a winter of doing corporate gigs, I looked forward to this one. Walking into the gallery to get our buffet set up was a little like stepping into the pages of a lushly illustrated children's book, but I didn't have time to really look. I met the gallery manager and got the portable grill going in the service room. And once the servers were circulating with platters of seared scallops and satay beef and those tiny lamb chops with their own obliging handles, I picked up a plate of mini samosas and started circulating as well. Lionel, my boss, was not technically working the event, but he'd come to work the crowd, dressed in the bespoke suit he brought home from a trip to Hong Kong and a bolo tie he'd picked up at the Calgary Stampede. I ran into my old boyfriend, Zolan, who greeted me with the same detached fondness I felt for him. Scarfing down samosas, he told me about his new project, digital collages of Tinder profiles. Two of his friends joined us and talked enviously about the impending announcement of a huge art prize for which Jake Chalice was considered a front runner. Near the entrance, dressed in a black suit with a dark gray t-shirt, his straight dark hair parted in the middle, the artist himself held court. The minute the rush was over, I grabbed a chance to take in the show. 4 huge oil canvases depicted influential figures and their dreams. The first was the naturalist, Rachel Carson. She lay in a bed of ferns, her sleeping face both somber and luminous, and birds filled the sky. Jake Chalice's style was not what I knew as hyperrealism. It was almost impressionistic, dabs of transparent color guiding your eye to areas of the canvas that were immaculately detailed. The scene was tender. It had an interior radiance that suggested the world was good. But what seemed to be a pool of brackish water near the bottom of the canvas was really a welter of bird carcasses. I didn't see this at first, but then I did, and my eyes stung. In the beautiful articulation of the bird's feathers was a world of loss. I turned to move on, and there was the artist. In fact, he was watching me intently. It was as though we had stepped into the antechamber of each other's unconscious mind. I wanted to say something about the picture, but his face was filled with so much emotion that I just gestured towards the painting and said, "Thank you." He said, "No, thank you. I saw you checking it out. He paused, and before he could go on, someone else was there bringing him a drink. And that was that. But for the rest of the night, I was entirely tuned to Jake. I knew where he was at every moment. I was taken with his listening posture and the quickness of his expressions. I had to remind myself not to stare as I tried to work out what it was that appealed to me so much. Most people would assume my attraction to him was sexual. Well, yes, of course, but not only. I'm just going to read a couple of pages now from Jake's point of view, which is in the third person. And I thought this was a fitting passage because it's Jake trying to deal with the publicity around his art show. So it seemed sort of on point. Jake visited the gallery 3 times before the show closed, every time for media interviews. He had to live with the fact that he attracted more attention because of who he was. He wanted to say to journalists, "I'd love to talk to you, but this is not about my father, okay?" Phoebe, his agent, advised against it. She said it would just excite people's curiosity. Every interviewer asked some version of, "What would your father have thought about this show?" Jake's usual response was, "I learned never to predict what my father was thinking." A total lie. But what do you talk about? He was mortified at being asked to explain his paintings, their meaning. As for aesthetics, well, the elements in his work that people remarked as beautiful, either the beauty made him a little sick, like he was in love with his own artistic gestures, or it came from somewhere entirely outside himself and he didn't want to focus on it and smudge it with his narcissism. The whole thing set up a brutal cage match between his ego and his dark twin self-loathing. He didn't really realize how bad it was until the day of his TVO interview, when the makeup person sat him down in front of a mirrored wall and brought the tuft of her foundation brush towards his face and said, "What is this, hun?" It was a raw patch between his eyebrows, just above the bridge of his glasses, not as big as a nickel, but bigger than a dime. This was a throwback to middle school, when he'd scratched all his skin off, not just his brow ridge, but also his elbows and behind his ears, mindlessly fretting at a body that hardly seemed to exist. When his parents noticed, they tried every incentive to get him to stop. First taking away his allowance, then his TV privileges, then his skateboard. Finally, they sent him to a counselor named Mrs. Whitmore, an art therapist. She said that whether you drew well or drew badly did not matter in the least to the work they would do together. But she discovered that he drew very well, and she was the one who encouraged him to start carrying a sketchbook around. She had a Yoda figure on a shelf, and she encouraged Jake to channel Yoda as a benign guardian whenever he felt tense. "Screw up, we all will," Yoda was supposed to say. "Kind let us be to ourselves and each other." Her theory was that Jake picked and scratched at himself as a preemptive punishment whenever he felt he had disappointed his parents. This made sense, although as Jake realized now, he excoriated himself just as much when good things happened as when he fucked up, and he couldn't recall her ever explaining that. But the kindness part was good advice. After he got home from TVO that day, he gently washed off his makeup and put a small round Band-Aid over the worrisome patch to keep his fingers off it. In sum, he was rotten at self-promotion, and it was hard on him. Phoebe said, "You seem eager to debrief all your doubts when you talk to media. Try to suppress that impulse, okay? Confess to someone else, your girlfriend." Isla, with her deep blue, almost indigo eyes and her transparent face, she was not at war with herself. If she saw something as good, she did it. She never thought about the impression she made on people. She was so unself-conscious, it was dazzling. She would stare at you as wide-eyed as a kid. She watched you because she was interested in what you were thinking and feeling. She wanted to figure it out. She was curious, self-affirming. She lived in the real world. And her father turned out to be Jake's beloved psych prof, Dr. Paul Coltrane. How amazed Jake was when this came out. He thought of Dr. Coltrane quoting Sigmund Freud, "Show me a normal person and I will cure them." And there was Isla, his own daughter, beautifully defying her father's science. That close? Rock star.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, the intro and the reading, and welcome back, I guess,
Yeah, thank you so much.
welcome back for the 5th time.
It's true, my launches have all been at McNally, sometimes in the restaurant, yeah.
So that's good too. So I got to read this book very early in the summer, because one of the best perks of working here is you get early access to the books you want to read. So that's great. And I found when I'm reading a new book by somebody that an author that I'm really familiar with, I'm often kind of making comparisons to other novels. I pick up things, and I wasn't really struck by that with you. And I was thinking your books are quite different from each other as far as I can tell. So I'm either missing a kind of common something, or like I'm curious what it is about a story that draws you to it. You've done everything historical, contemporary, everything from England to the Amazon to Ontario.
Well, I don't know. I mean, once in a while people have said, well, do you ever consider doing a sequel to such and such, you know? But it's very boring sitting working for 3 years alone in your room. And I just have the sense that a sequel would get tired for me. So yeah, I do sometimes, you know, because I see myself probably, I don't imagine I'll have very many more novels in me, and I sometimes try and look at what is characteristic of my work. And I think it's something sort of audacious, and that is that although I like to deal deeply with the psychology of my characters, I also like to take on something about the world. You know, it might have come from my Christian upbringing that we all thought we were going to save the world, and perhaps I see that with my writing, that I want to take on big questions, and I can see that sort of thing operating in all my books, as different as they might be.
And so the energy for that work, does it come from the characters, and getting to know the characters? And
I don't know. To an extent, especially after you've spent some time with them, and the writing comes easy, and they start sort of talking back, as writers say. I think I draw a lot of energy from language, really. You know, I will go for a walk and I will hear sentences that give me joy and have rhythm and so on. I think that's a big part of it.
So the novel opens, Isla's up on a kind of cliff looking down on Rich Bavakwa, who we will talk about, and his family, and clearly something's going on. As a reader, you know you're right in it. And it turns out that this is a scene later on in the book, and then the story can be back up, and then you work back towards this through this scene. And so what made you decide to just start in the middle of things like that?
Well, when I talked about trying to find commonalities. If you look back, all of my novels have plucked a scene from somewhere further down and brought it to the front. And I think that it's a technique writers do to, if you want to spend some time world building and creating characters, you also want to engage readers with, something is actually going to happen. So I think that probably was the impetus, just to establish the terms of the story.
Right.
I mean, there is a mystery in this story, but I want to use that phrase carefully, because it's not a genre mystery. And I think that, contrary to the headline of the Free Press today, the mystery genre, I think people that are used to reading mystery genres will not be really satisfied with how I've used the tropes of a mystery, but it does become a mystery eventually.
Right, there are elements of mystery.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, but
Yeah.
a literary mystery show, something.
Okay.
I don't know what we have to call it at all. The perspectives, as you point out, split or alternate, I guess, between Isla and Jake. And there are many splits in this book. In fact, the last section is called Fisher. And there's the landscape has crevices and gorges and ravines, and Isla and Jake have a breakup. And I couldn't help but think, and you've kind of alluded to the world out there and the split that we have politically and culturally. So that was very much on your mind as you wrote this, clearly?
Well, for sure. I mean, I think we're all, or many people at least, are sort of recognizing that the future that we imagine for ourselves, a society that would continue to go on much as it had before and possibly get better and better, that's probably a delusion, that, there's certain realities that we haven't probably paid enough attention to in terms of our limits on the planet. And so I think we're all facing a bit of a fissure like that, whether we think about it very frequently or not.
Right, yeah, and internally too, with Jake and Isla, that opening scene, Isla's describing it, but then she says, if this were a film, I would do such and such. And so she gets outside of herself and looks at, and there's a very kind of self-consciousness, self-awareness in Jake as well. He, one of his paintings is interpreted as Ayn Rand, watching Ayn Rand sleep. Split there. He wears this tuxedo, is too ironic, I'm not trying too hard. So he's very kind of self-aware. What significance is there in that self-consciousness of these two characters in particular?
Well, Isla may have developed more self-consciousness as the novel goes on, but one of the things I loved about working with her as a character was that she fit that description that Jake has of her, that she's pretty comfortable with herself. Whereas Jake has the self-awareness of a child who of somebody who grew up as an unhappy child. You know, may have picked up in the passage I read that his parents' solution for his anxiety was to punish him. You know? So he has this sort of self-awareness that's very hard won because he's so anxious. And I think that's why he's so drawn to Violet, because she doesn't second guess herself. She is pretty much at home in her own skin.
Yeah. Right. Is there a self-awareness, or I guess a self-awareness when creating art? Like when you're writing, are you aware of yourself and what you bring, or how you intrude on the story? Or
you know, I think, you know how they say about dreams that every character in your dream is a manifestation of yourself. I think there's some of that in writing as well, that you can't really give a character a depth of feeling that you don't have yourself. And so I think you tend to split yourself off sometimes into the different characters, and you exaggerate the traits on one side of the split
Right.
in one character.
I was thinking also that conventionally or not that long ago, as an author, you could assume some kind of objective some place from which to write.
Yeah.
And I think we've come to realize that that's just a convention, that in fact that some place was kind of white and Western, and often male. And as booksellers, we're always aware of who's writing the book and where to place it, things like that.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that too, and like, is it necessary increasingly for an author to admit, I guess, where they're coming from?
To admit it in the text, I mean?
Well, I wonder if in the text.
Yeah.
Or,
Well, I tend to want to probe, the things in my characters' lives that I'm probing in my own. And these are two very privileged characters. My three main characters are all very privileged in different ways. And, I write out of immense privilege, not that I'm particularly wealthy as middle-class Canadians go, but even the fact that I have the space and the time and the freedom to question issues like those around climate change. If I were living in the north of India where whole cities were flooded, I would not be thinking about it in the abstract. But my characters do have that privilege, and yeah, I guess it reflects mine as well.
yeah, I think so. These are some of the controversies that have been around book publishing recently, where an author doesn't, I don't know, admit or whether the industry doesn't admit. There's a controversy around American Dirt, if you know about that one, where you can't tell a story about somebody else without kind of admitting that you're the one telling it and you've got a different privileged position.
Right, yeah. Well, I certainly thought about that with 5 Wives, because I opted not to tell the story from the perspective of the Waorani people, and that's probably the most important perspective from which that story could be told, but it's not a perspective that I could assume. And similarly here, I think people might say, do we need another novel about middle-class privileged Canadians? But I think that the task they have of deepening their consciousness of what's going on, it's interesting to me because it's not a task that we are taking up terribly successfully in the Western world. So,
yeah, and I don't think the issue is that nobody or somebody has to stop telling their own stories. It's just that there's a wide range of stories that need to be told. And I think we're working hard trying to get people to read a wider variety of stories. But, so it's a novel full of ideas. They swirl around. I found it fascinating. Isla is full of ideas. She seems to be interested in everything. She's a cook, but she comes to cooking through her interest in history, which seems like an interesting way to come at it. And I wondered if you've kind of alluded to this, you anticipated this a little bit, but you entered the novel thinking about these issues and wanting to bring them in. That's what you'd say?
yeah, probably. I always have trouble knowing where a novel started for me. To an extent, this novel started, John quoted Caroline Anderson, and I remember her saying, I never write about happy people. And to an extent, this novel started that way. I thought I will create a character who has the best chance to take on the issues we're facing, because so often we seem to feel that we have enough of our own personal problems or family problems, that we're burdened enough with that sort of thing. And so how can we take on the wider problems of the world? And so I thought, well, I'm going to have a happy character who has a good chance to take these kinds of things on. So it's hard for me to separate out where idea and character divide.
They kind of come along as you write.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, sure. So I
You realize, of course, I'm just reverse engineering everything right now and
Trying to
making it
figure it
up. But yeah.
Putting
I had no idea.
spot. I told you earlier, we got our copies mixed up, and I said, this is the copy with the questions, and that's the copy with the answers. So there's a third character I mentioned, or I promised we'd get to him, Reg Bavacqua,
Yeah.
who is a very interesting guy, and he embodies, or at least raises, some issues. So tell us about Reg.
Well, I taught once with a man whose surname was Bavacqua. I thought that's a pretty good name for a water baron, right? Drinks water. Yeah, he's kind of like a doppelganger to my character Jake, in that they were friends when they were children, but he didn't have the privilege Jake had. Jake's father, as a cabinet minister, Jake has a lot of social collateral, and Reg didn't have that. But in a sense, he became a more true heir to Jake's father's legacy than Jake did himself, in that he absorbed all the, capitalist ambition and so on. Things go badly between them.
Yes, they do. We don't want to give too much away. There's a line, you're describing the landscape of crevices and ravines, and Reg's lodge is nested like a tick in one of those flanks. I just shuddered. What a line for a room.
Well, it was I was thinking. That's not my
Right.
metaphor.
Okay. Still a good line. Reg has almost a father-son relationship with Jake's father, and also replaces him. So, and you kind of told us about Jake's father, but tell us more about
Well,
what that is.
I read a book called Losing Earth by Nathaniel Rich that outlines the circumstance in about 50 years ago, when scientists were very clear about the effects of carbon in the atmosphere, but when the Reagan administration began, they decided to repress that science. Exxon actually had a fund for pivoting to alternative fuels, and they decided they saw sort of a free ride to continue to develop fossil fuels, so they decided to turn the funds that they were going to use for this transition into misinformation. And there was a huge misinformation campaign. So in fact, 50 years ago, people were much clearer about climate change than they are today. And I was so aghast at that, that there could be, I don't know how many, a few score of individuals that would make this kind of astonishing decision that would have such geopolitical consequences. But when you write a novel, you want to individuate things. And so Jake's father is a petroleum engineer who worked for Exxon in those years. And so for Jake, that sense of complicity that many people wrestle with is very personal, because his father was one of these agents of misinformation. So there is, talk about fissures.
Yes.
There is quite a gap develops between Jake and his father.
Yeah, I was going to ask about
Yeah.
that too. They have a very conflicted relationship. So what is that like?
Yeah. Well, I was interested in the way, Jake's father's commitment to capitalism was somehow in his bones, and I'm interested in the kind of parenting that a parent does too when they see competition being at the heart of everything. And so Jake had kind of a tough time.
He tries to reject, but can't quite. He's kind of immersed in it, I guess.
Well, I don't think it's it's easy for any kid to separate themselves from the ideology of their parents. You know, his father is dead in this time frame of the book, but it's still something that he's working with.
Yeah. Reg also introduces the ideas of wealth and entitlement. Isla has a restaurant that's very high end out of town, and Reg is able to use it as a truck stop.
Yeah.
It's on its way to his lodge, and so and Isla kind of gets confronted with that she cooks, she feeds people, she says, but then she's asked, do people need to eat like that? And so what is the implication of her being, I guess, implicated in that?
Yeah. Well, these are weird questions to ask because we're all foodies, right?
I know.
We all love.
Because we're all implicated.
Yeah, we all love these fantastic ingredients that are flown in from around the world, and you know, I guess I'm just sort of interested in how we begin to define excellence when so many of the things that we have considered excellent ambitions and you know, ways of fulfilling ourselves and being fully realized, that they are actually inconsistent with our continued survival. So Jake says about Isla that she's always going back to first principles. So I kind of used her to be asking that kind of question, because they're not questions we ask very often. It sounds moralistic to ask it.
Yeah, or to answer it.
We love eating out, right? All of us.
But some of the customers you point out are they don't know that much about food. It's conspicuous consumption more than it is really feeding.
Right.
Food.
Yeah.
So I want to get into like combining a few of these things, because we've talked about how difficult it is to talk about what we're implicated in. There's a joke that you've put in there that a fish doesn't know what water is. Jake questions literally whether can I critique colonial capitalist racist world because he's born into it. He uses the language of his father, and we kind of talked about it. And I was thinking, David Bergen faced the same kind of question last night between fiction and nonfiction in this context of a historical novel. And you've got that kind of, there's the nonfiction of issues and these ideas, and then the fiction that you're trying to keep at it. When you write nonfiction, you are writing towards answers. You have to make a statement, you have to draw a conclusion. But if you make too much of a statement in a novel, it comes across as heavy-handed or preachy or something. So that's a delicate balance. How do you manage it?
I have a lot of conversations with writer friends about this. It's very hard to, you know, I sort of would assert that I'm not didactic because I have no answers, right? I'm protected from being didactic by that. But I don't know, I guess I just kind of have decided that some of the really fundamental things that we generally consider, you know, we take for granted, have to be questioned in our fiction as they are questioned in our lives. Otherwise, we're silent about them. The narrative never shifts. It's one of the perplexing things about our age, why the narrative doesn't shift, there's lots of movement in the last few years, and I don't mean to dismiss it, but overall, socially, rather than making the changes one might assume a rational society would make, some of these issues like climate change have become politicized in a really, really shocking way. And that's perplexing to me. It's a question that I want to ask as a writer.
And so writing a novel about asking questions?
Sure.
Yeah, because you don't necessarily want to find the answers, or you.
Well, I don't know if there are easy answers exactly. But it's a way of having this sort of conversation that I want to be having in my life. I, can have it in my writing. And I do have it with many of my friends in this room as well.
But we're all, I was thinking, stumbled on this, but we're implicated in the environmental, I'm going to go drive home after this. And so your characters are, interestingly, they're implicated in all of these issues, and they can't kind of escape it. There's no easy answer for it. Right. It's fascinating. Yeah. And I find when I read nonfiction, you're just so tempted to, that's it. Like, you know,
There's the answer.
yeah, exactly. It's as easy as that. But a novel is actually richer because it just keeps asking. I purposely avoid talking about the second half of the novel. You pointed out there's a mystery element. Did you set about wanting to have a mystery, or did that just kind of form as you
It kind of evolved. And I liked the fact that it did, because I like this whole, you know, we talk a lot about trying to change the narrative, and mysteries have such defined conventions. You know, we all know the tropes of a mystery, and it was interesting to me that, you know, just as we have trouble in our lives shaking off old narratives, so does this book, in a sense. It slides into that form of a mystery eventually.
Yeah. So there's lots of splits, as I said, and I'm constantly kind of questioning. And I thought I've kind of turned that on its head and tried to look at the novel. Where is there the possibility of hope? Where is the opposite of split? There's love and relationships in it. There's friendships. Does art have something to contribute to healing or bringing things together?
Well, I mean, art concerns itself with the human mindset, doesn't it? And that seems to be where the problem lies for us. It isn't fundamentally a scientific problem. It's a problem of will and human resolve. And so, yeah, I think art concerns itself with that for sure. Jade might not have found the solution.
No, but he struggles with that.
Yeah.
There's a breach. He later on, as he's drawing nature, he feels like he's going to finally overcome the breach, and he feels good. But then he looks at his drawings later on, and he sees his fingerprints. He can't get out of his own.
Trying to erase himself from the landscape. Yeah.
But somehow
Yeah.
you need a little bit of highlight. You can't.
You need a little bit of
highlight.
Oh, right.
Right. You can't
Yeah.
fixate on that.
Well, I have hope in her as a character at the end, and because I think she, you know, she is fundamentally whole, and she is taking things on, and maybe I'll have to write a sequel this time. I don't know.
So before I hand it over to the audience, I like to ask authors when I get this chance to speak to them for book recommendations. Some of my best reading comes from authors' recommendations.
Right.
So what would you tell us about?
Well, you had David Bergen in a chair here yesterday, and I have to say his new novel is just stunning. I think it's wonderful. But seeing you already knew about David Bergen, I'll mention Cedar Bowers, who someone asked on my behalf to write a blurb on the back of my book, so I hastily went and read her book, which is a novel called Astra. She's a young writer from one of the Gulf Islands of the BC coast, and I was really entranced by that book. She uses point of view in a way that really interests me. A lot of different, it's multifaceted, and really a writer to watch, I think.
Okay.
So Astra by Cedar Bowers.
We'll bring in more copies.
Okay.
Okay, so off to the audience to do some of the work now. Questions.
Yes, indeed. And we can start off with a question that came in via YouTube from Leanne. She asks, Joan, when you go for a walk and hear those sentences that bring you joy, do you remember them, or do you carry a recording? Your use of language is a joy for us.
Oh, that's a lovely question. I actually tend to remember them. I guess maybe it doesn't happen often enough that it's a burden, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so given the fact that most of your books about climate change, first of all, it is my opinion that these books, Wild Hope and especially The Opening Sky, would be very good candidates for the high school English curriculum, at least maybe grade 10, grade 11. That said,
Good plan.
that said, if this were your goal, what advice would you give to writers who upon these novels being published would want to get these books into the high schools?
Yes.
Oh, and this.
How is that done? I would assume that maybe you have to, I don't know, publishers probably send copies of books to departments of education if they think that they're suitable candidates. I don't know if there's lobbying things that could happen.
So tell me.
If you have anybody with influence, feel free.
Okay, the second part of this is if you were going to advocate for educational literacy, as I do, given the current political climate, especially what's going on in the educational system in the United States, especially in the state of Florida, where they're banning books left and right. Again, if you were going to advocate for educational literacy, would this put limits on what you would write about?
Well, I think it's true you can't set out to write a novel on spec to be used in a classroom. At least I wouldn't be interested in doing that. It sounds pretty deadly. But I mean, you raise a whole huge political issue that we're all appalled by. But yeah, I don't think the solution is authors beginning to curtail what they write so that it meets an educational mandate, probably. But thanks.
I must have asked all the questions.
Sorry, and you may actually just have to say it, just have to replace the batteries. I'm sorry.
I can speak loud now. First of all, I wanted to say I've been waiting a long time for this book. Having read all of and loved every one of your novels.
Thank you.
And I guess I just wanted to say a thank you to myself, but also from a whole lot of people in this audience who are your neighbors and friends. In the Lunston, Social Heights, North End neighborhood. And say how pleased and honored we are to have you as a neighbor, not only because of your great books, but also because you put your money where your mouth is, and you are an active environmentalist in our own community, especially playing a role for the last 4 years on the Bannerman Green Not-for-Profit Housing Co-op. So to have both is a real joy, and both of you not in the North End, eat your heart out or else move to the North End. I guess my only question is, how long do I have to wait?
I wouldn't even go there, but thank you so much, Judy. And of course, I feel, it's totally mutual. And being part of this neighborhood movement has really driven home to me how focused our society is on the individual and how much the solutions lie in community efforts. So.
And were there any other questions from the audience? Oh, yes.
It's not really a question. I think I heard you right that you were mentioning that when you write, you're not didactic. You're keeping on asking questions rather than proposing answers. I guess what I find so compelling about your work is the strong moral thread throughout it. And that in fact, to me, I remember, I think it's the afterword of Five Wives. There's no question in my mind, this is very arrogant, where you're coming from. But I think what's so important to me is that you do it through story, you do it through the characters, that rather than by saying this is how it is, and you allow for the complexities to come out through that. So I just want to say thank you so much for deeply moral work. And I didn't come here planning to buy that book, but I'm planning to change my mind.
That's good. Well, thank you so much.
Hi, Joan.
Hi.
So everybody clearly loves your fiction. I was just curious if you, your work is often, political and social or historical. I was just wondering if you ever thought or ever intend to pursue nonfiction. Just curious.
You know, it's very weird, but since I started writing fiction, I can't write anything else. It's like pulling teeth. I mean, I have to sometimes write short pieces for various things. It just does my head in. I don't know. I mean, fiction, Dari, as you know yourself, is just so much more fun, right? Yeah.
I'm excited to read this book from what you've already described. You said you originally wanted just one voice to start, and then Jake popped out and started speaking. And what you described Jake as his hidden vulnerabilities, was that what brought his voice forward, or was there something else in Jake's character that poked at you and said he needs to have a voice too?
I think I got to the point in the book where there were a lot of misunderstandings between Isla and Jake. And if I had stayed with Isla telling the story in the first person, we would never have gotten to, you know, where that impasse was between them. So, I mean, I just love multiple points of views just because of the way they cast light, one character, you know, back on the other. And there's certain things that I'm not sure I know how to deal with in a singular point of view.
So we have a question.
But 7 was a lot in 5 hours. There's a question. Oh.
Yes, we wander over there in just for a moment. We just had one question that came in online, which coincidentally asks, what was it like to write a contemporary novel again? Was it easier or harder than 5 Wives, or just different?
Well, a novel based on research gives you so much material up front, and that's a huge benefit to an author, I think. I mean, people always say, oh, you poor you had to do so much research. But no, it's just like found material. So an invented story is harder, but it felt really good to be writing about my own time, because I'm so interested in the weird things that are happening in the world. So it felt good to try and take them on.
Perfect. And this will be our final question for the evening.
Hi, I'm thinking about that really thought-provoking lecture you did on the novel, the modern realist novel, and maybe its failures or its shortcomings when it comes to tackling something like climate change. And one piece of that was, you know, the novel's focus on kind of individual self-discovery as opposed to sort of a collective responsibility. I'm curious if you resolved all those in your novel.
Yeah, well, you might look at this novel as an admission of failure because it is still concerned with the psyches of its characters. And I'm not sure I'm ever going to get to writing a kind of collective novel. It seems like there are enough things in our psyches still here right now that we need to deal with to take us forward. So no, I haven't solved that. Nor have I solved decentering the human, which is another issue. We have two new writers in Winnipeg this fall that I'm seeing in the back, Leslie and Russell, and just wanted to recognize you and call you. Russell, you had your hand up, and I know John said we were done, but.
Well, we can squeeze in one more.
Okay.
I have a really simple question. What's your favorite, first drafts or going back to work over them again? Because that's a difference we have between us.
Oh, no question. It's going back. I take the pleasure in the rewriting, not in the first draft at all. First drafts are brutal. That was an easy question.
Well, thank you so very much, Joan. Thank you. That was Russell Wangerski and Leslie Bryan Hoek, if I recall correctly, who are both exceptional writers as well. So welcome back to Winnipeg. We'll now turn things over to Charlene Deal of the Writers Festival after some final words from Joan and or Chris.
Oh boy.
What should we say?
Well, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the book. Thank you for coming. Thanks for all your thoughtful responses to all my questions.
Well, thank you as well. And this this room full of people just means so much to me. The presence of readers, you know, you work alone for several years and then you come into a setting like this where people are such thoughtful readers, and it's a gift. So thank you for being here.
Thinks I'm shorter than I am. Wow, what an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Joan, for this extraordinary novel, and Chris for this option for us to sit in on a conversation between people who love to read and love to think about ideas. Joan, I've been looking for this book for, I guess, since we had the sessions at the library in June, and so curious to see how you are going to frame out these big questions of like the real crisis of our time, which all of us are, you know, embedded in and implicated in, and with which we all have to deal as individuals as well as parts of neighborhoods and communities. So thank you for bringing your determination and your, you know, your moral core to a very big task, which I think is on the minds of all of us. And I had a conversation with my daughter a couple of days ago. She said, "I'm so sad. I woke up so sad this morning because I just think everything is wrecked and I don't know how to have my life." And I think that's a lot of weight to carry when you're 23. And I think it's up to all of us to really be like pressing down on these questions and finding our ways to these answers and asking really hard questions and filtering them through human experience the way that you do is a huge gift to all of us. Will you please join me in thanking Joan and Chris. So this is the second night in the signature series here last night. Many of you were here also with David Bergen, who is hiding at the back. I know because I was standing next to him. So we're now two amazing writers in, and coming up we still have a whole array, and I'm just going to give you a quick lineup. Jordan Apel is here on Tuesday. Beatrice Mozionier is here on Friday. On Saturday, which is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we welcome Daryl McLeod, who is a GG winner. And that evening we call Mijote Stories in honor of Elder Theodore Fontaine. Casey Plett is here on October 7th. Alicia Elliott is here on October 11th. We have a little deke to the side for the spectacular kids author John Clausen on October 14th. Emma Dahue is here on October 16th. Michael Crummy is here on October 17th. And if you're not gasping by now, there's something definitely wrong with you. And at that point, all of us running the actual festival, we go to sleep for about a week. And then on October 27th, Malky Shea Rice is here with his new novel. So it's an extraordinary lineup, and it just says so much about the health and vitality of writing in this country. It is just extraordinary. And here we are in the heart of the country, in the very center of Turtle Island, in this extraordinary store, which is itself a cultural hub. And so I also want to pause to give a big shout out to Chris, who's not only, you know, pretty good conversation partner, a pretty good store owner, and to Angela also, and to John, who hops up and down from behind the screen here to make all the magic. This is he's probably doing that right now. This is a really amazing place that allows us to gather and hear conversations like this, and to find books with ideas that we otherwise might not encounter, and to have these large conversations and this feel of belonging to one another as we work on really hard, big challenges. So a huge shout out to McNally Robinson. Let's make some noise for them, shall we? So I got some coaching from Alina last night, because I missed an important part, which is what the heck is a festival anyway? So we started on the 20th, which is Wednesday, and we run full steam until October 18th. We have all the events here. We also have book chats at the library, and we have some events at Kilter Brewing Company, and we have some events in French at various places. And you can find all this information in this cute little booklet, which used to be a book, but now like we are paying homage to decent tree health. So we are doing 1 page instead of 125. So that's a small effort. You can find these on the signing table or various points around here. And I'd also really encourage you to visit our website, which is thinairfestival.ca, where most of the writers that we're featuring this year, we have 63 writers, and most of them have submitted videos of their own work, readings from their books. It's just a treasure trove and a great place to spend some time. I'd also want to mention that Joan is doing one of our writing craft workshops, really about tangling with climate change as a writer. So if it's not already full, it probably will be full tonight. So you might want to sign up for that when you get home. And you can find that information on our website. So you are instructed to stay put until Joan is transported safely, I believe is the terminology, to the signing desk by the
David had a litter last night, right?
yeah, David had a litter last night, or a wagon or something. You can purchase the books at the cash desk or after you get the book signed, but you're not to move until Joan is safely over there, and you must pay for the book before you leave the store. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and I hope we see you plenty of times again. And once more, thank you so much, Joan. Thank you, Chris.